So, would like to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky. If it wasn't for Noam, when I was 18 years old, I worked at a activist bookstore in Davis Square, and I bought a tape, back in the day, tapes. And I bought a tape, I think it was $4, of Noam Chomsky giving a talk. I bought a second one of Howard Zinn, and it opened my mind. I can honestly say that was the trigger for me to become an activist. So I don't want to be too long-winded, but would like to introduce Noam. Thank you for coming, Noam.
Like it or not, we happen to be living at the most important moment in human history. It's a moment when the human species is going to make a critical decision whether to live or die. Not literally disappear, of course, but the remnants that will remain will have few prospects of decent life. We've already made that decision for a huge number of our fellow creatures. Species destruction now is, as you may know, at the level of about 65 million years ago, when a huge asteroid hit the Earth, ended the age of the mammals, of the dinosaurs, opened the way for some small mammals to survive, ultimately leading to us, and we're now reliving the experience of the asteroid, unfortunately for the rest of the world. And we're next if we proceed on our current course, and in fact it may not be long. We're talking about generations, not centuries. You probably know there's a famous doomsday clock, which is run by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists ever since the dawn of the atomic age, 1947. Every year, a large group of distinguished specialist experts try to estimate how far humans are from total extermination. That would be midnight. Clock moves up and back towards midnight. Last year, it moved 2 minutes. It's every January. Last January, it moved 2 minutes closer to midnight, up to 3 minutes before midnight, closest it had been for about 30 years. This year, just a couple days ago, the clock was set again for 3 minutes to midnight. Midnight means termination. There was an accompanying statement that referred to the two huge problems that we have to either do something about quickly or say goodbye to each other. One is nuclear weapons, the other is destruction of the environment. The statement did say that there had been some small steps forward, but not enough to justify moving the hands. On the nuclear front, they said that the deal with Iran is a slight advance in reducing international tensions and the threat of major war. The United States is constantly threatening war against Iran and has in fact been carrying out war against Iran. We proudly describe our cyber war, which carries out sabotage and destruction in Iran. The Pentagon regards cyber war as an act of war which justifies military action in response. NATO recently agreed that the mutual defense element of the NATO treaty, it will be invoked by cyber war. If any country is attacked by cyber war, all of them have the right to respond by military force. We, of course, arrogate that right to ourselves. So that was a small step forward, which may not survive the next election. Every Republican candidate wants to remove it They only compete in how rapidly they'll do so. But that was a small step forward. On the environmental issue, there was, again, a small step forward. They refer to the Paris conference last month, which reached some kinds of agreements, by no means sufficient, but some agreements. They point out that it doesn't mean much unless it becomes a binding treaty. It was just voluntary agreements. The press, like the New York Times, Washington Post, explained clearly why it couldn't be a binding treaty. It's because of the United States. The Republican Congress will simply not accept the treaty, and in fact promises to reverse everything that has been done. That's, again, next November. Means that for these reasons alone, and there are many others, there's some pretty awesome decisions that are going to be made within the next couple of months in the United States. And you see it every day if you read the paper. So this morning, for example, the New York Times has an article on an energy bill. They're optimistic. They say it might get bipartisan support, which is very rare. Here's what it says. In order to achieve a bipartisan consensus, Ms. Murkowski and Ms. Cantwell, Republican and Democrat, had to significantly scale down the scope of the bill. It does not include language to drastically increase fossil fuel production, as most Republicans would like, nor does it boldly address climate change, as most Democrats want. Now, that is a stark choice in November for this reason alone. The same article offers some good news as they present it. Since the passage of the last major energy law in 2007, the United States has gone from fears of oil and gas shortages to becoming the world's leading producer of both fuels. So that's the upbeat part, which is simply collective insanity. No further comment needed. And very common. Almost every comment on discussion of this topic talks about it. We've reached 100 years of energy independence. We're overflowing with gas and oil. The only problem with the glut is that the energy corporations aren't making enough profit, but other than that, it's fine. Every day in the science journals, you read new evidence about how grim the prospects are. So a couple of weeks ago, it was discovered that a huge iceberg in Greenland, huge iceberg, which it was thought had been anchored to the ground so it wouldn't melt too quickly, has in fact broken free and is now melting much faster than it was assumed. It will significantly raise sea level. Another recent study discovered that the rate of climate change today is 100 times as fast as at any period in geological history, which we recorded. By other estimates, it's 1,000 times as fast. And it goes on like that. There are another report in the current issue of the MIT Technical Journal estimates that here at our latitude, average climate change amounts to moving south 10 meters every day and increasing. It's already a very likely factor in major disasters that are taking place. The Darfur crisis was a major factor in it, was desertification, large-scale desertification, which is probably a result of climate change, which drove nomadic tribes into agricultural areas, set up serious conflicts leading to the horrors that you know about. The war in Syria was preceded by several years of the worst drought in history in that region, which goes back thousands of years, destroyed the agricultural economy, drove huge numbers of people into the cities, set up the basis for which could be sparked by the crisis that then took place. Now the country is destroying itself. If you turn to, say, South Asia, rise in the sea level will wipe out large parts of Bangladesh. Melting of the Himalayan glaciers, which is going on, will eliminate the water supply for South Asia. That'll mean a couple of billion people starving, dying, trying to go somewhere. If you think that the refugee crisis is serious now, we haven't seen anything. And in fact, right now, the United Nations just yesterday came out with the estimate of the number of people driven from their homes in the world. It's by far the highest on record. It's almost 1 in 100 fleeing from their homes and increasing. Well, that's climate change. The doomsday clock was set up originally in 1947 because of the concern over nuclear war, and that's another issue today too. So the statement that accompanies the setting of the doomsday clock a couple of days ago discusses, quote, highlighted tensions between the United States and Russia, continued conflict in Ukraine and Syria, tensions over the South China Sea, Russian and American nuclear weapons modernization programs. For the United States, Obama's program is about $1 trillion in coming years of modernization. Those who like arcane facts may recall that we have a legal obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to be taking good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons, but we're going in the other direction under the guidance of the Nobel Peace Laureate, so $1 trillion coming up of modernization. One of the main ideas is to try to improve tactical nuclear weapons so that they have lower yield, which sounds good until you think it's true. But what it means, as many experts have pointed out, is that there's a greater temptation to use them. And if you use them, it sets off an escalatory effect, which goes right up to doomsday. So that's what we're doing now. In the last couple of weeks, William Perry, former Defense Secretary, a conservative, highly respected specialist on nuclear issues and no alarmist, says, we are facing nuclear dangers today that are in fact more likely to erupt into a nuclear conflict than during the Cold War. In the Cold War, we and Russia were in the process of dismantling nuclear weapons. Today, in contrast, both Russia and the United States are beginning a complete rebuilding of Cold War nuclear arsenals, and today Russia is threatening the use of nuclear weapons. He doesn't mention that the United States has always threatened the use of nuclear weapons. Our nuclear posture remains committed to first use, even against non-nuclear states. Actually, if you haven't read it, a chilling indication of what our nuclear posture is appeared about 20 years ago during the Clinton years, the first major reassessment of nuclear policy after the end of the Cold War. Called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence. It's mostly declassified, enough to send chills up your spine. It explains, this is Clinton, not Bush, it explains that the Strategic Command, which is in control of nuclear weapons policy and use, it says we must, in the Cold War, post-Cold War period, we have to retain the right of first use of nuclear weapons, even against non-nuclear states. We must furthermore project a persona of irrationality and vindictiveness in order to intimidate people. It's good for our policies to get people in the world to think that we're unpredictable, that we might lash out wildly. keeps them under control. And then it adds that nuclear weapons cast a shadow over every conflict that exists, meaning since others know that we are irrational and vindictive and have the right to use nuclear weapons when we want, if there's a conflict, they'll tend to back off. That means that nuclear weapons are being used constantly. It's a point that Dan Ellsberg has been making for years. If, say, you and I go into a store and I have a gun and aim it at the storekeeper and you demand that he give you his cash, even though I don't shoot the gun, I'm using it. That's use of nuclear weapons, constant. That's our policy, and now the Russians are threatening the use of nuclear weapons. Well, if you look over the record of nuclear weapons strategy in history for the last 70 years, it's just a near miracle that we've survived. William Perry, in these same comments that I just was quoting, refers to another recently discovered accident, hundreds of accidents, thousands that come very close to war. And he brought up one which hadn't been known till recently from November 1979 when he was in the National Security Staff receiving information about our automated detection systems. And they determined that 200 missiles were attacking us from Russia. The rest of the story is told by Bruce Blair, another leading nuclear weapons specialist. He says that the information reached the National Security Advisor, speaking of Brzezinski, and he was just picking up the phone to call President Carter to tell him to launch a retaliatory strike when the news came in that it was another mistake for many of them. So that's one recent case where we came remarkably close. And there are many others. I mentioned that the clock now is back to where it was 30 years ago. And what happened 30 years ago? Well, the Reagan administration, early 80s, when it came in, decided to test Russian defenses. So it launched what the Russians would fear to be air, naval, and naval attacks against Russia, and even a nuclear attack, called the nuclear alert, to try to elicit information about how the Russians would respond. Well, it turned out that it was understood at the time that it was pretty risky, but now that the Russian archives have been released, it's understood that it was a major war scare. It came very close. This is Abel Archer, if you want to look it up on the internet. The U.S. intelligence studies today say that we came very close to war because the Russians took it seriously. Not surprisingly, they're very vulnerable. This was also a time of very significant international tensions. The U.S. was placing advanced Pershing missiles in Western Europe, which had 5 to 10 minute flight time to Moscow. Russia was, of course, surrounded by nuclear missiles always on all of its borders. And the United States had just announced the SDI, the Star Wars Initiative. Strategic analysts on all sides understand that what's called missile defense is in fact the first strike weapon. If it ever works, which is questionable, it could not conceivably stop a first strike, but it's imaginable that it could stop a retaliatory strike, which makes it a first strike weapon. So when we place missile defense on the borders of Russia, they understand that it's providing the foundation for a first strike, and aren't happy about it. All of this was going on in the early 80s when Abel Archer was underway. More information came out later. Turns out that the Russian automated systems detected a U.S. missile attack. Their systems are much more primitive than ours. Ours have satellite guidance, so basically you can see around the Earth. Theirs are eyesight, radar guided, so they get very brief warning. And of course there's much less sophisticated technically. So they detected a missile attack. The protocol is for that information to be transmitted to the high command and the head of the government, Yeltsin at that time, and Andropov, and at which point they would decide whether to launch a retaliatory attack or not. It had to pass through the hands of a particular person, Vladimir Petrov, Stanislav Petrov. He simply decided not to transmit the order. Otherwise, the clock would be at midnight. Now, that's happened before. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a point at which Kennedy had established a quarantine around Cuba. There were Russian submarines there, and they were under attack by U.S. destroyers, death charges. The submarine commanders had no contact with the outside world. They assumed that a war had started, and they planned to launch their nuclear-tipped torpedoes, which probably would have set off a major nuclear war. In order to do so, 3 submarine commanders have to agree. 2 agreed, 1 refused. Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov and Petrov are responsible for our survival, among many others. There are studies in the United States. We don't have good records about Russia, but there have been some studies in the United States from declassified material of what the level of near accidents is. There was a major study in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists not long ago, studied available data on false alarms from 1977 to 1983, and it found between 43 and 255 per year. There's no reason to think that that's changing. In fact, if William Perry and others are correct, the threat's increasing. The author of this study, nuclear scientist Seth Baum, he writes that nuclear war is the black swan we can never see except in that brief moment when it's killing us. We delay eliminating the risk at our own peril. Now is the time to address the threat because now we are still alive. And tomorrow we might not be because these things are happening regularly and the threat is increasing. And there are known current cases. Read them in the newspaper. So a couple of weeks ago, a B-52, nuclear-capable B-52, by accident flew near one of the Chinese islands in the South China Sea. Chinese weren't very happy about it. Fortunately, they didn't respond. We might ask how we'd respond if a Chinese nuclear-capable bomber, if they had any, they don't, was, say, flying over a Caribbean island. Well, they didn't react. Also, a couple of weeks ago, a U.S. F-16 military jet piloted by a Turkish pilot, part of the Turkish Air Force, with U.S. equipment, of course, shot down a Russian bomber. The bomber was bombing in Syria, and if you take a look at the map, there's a piece of Turkey that protrudes pretty deeply into Syria. And in the course of the bombing run, bombing ISIS, the Russian bomber passed across the tip of this protruding part of Turkey for 17 seconds and was shot down, landed in Syria towards which it was heading. The Russians did react. They didn't react by military force, but they reacted by bringing in high-level, advanced anti-aircraft systems, much more advanced than had been there before, which blocks any further flight. They sent a missile cruiser in the Mediterranean towards Syria, building up their naval position there. Fortunately, it didn't lead to war. It could have. Not long after that, a Russian military jet in Eastern Europe came literally within seconds of hitting a Danish commercial airliner full of people in it. Again, you can imagine what the consequences of that might be. The major arms control journal, Arms Control Today, writes that both sides are practicing rapid mobilization and redeployment of forces to the Russia-NATO border, and both sides believe a war is no longer unthinkable. More collective insanity by the leadership on all sides. And worse than that, the record shows that the leaders just don't care. And furthermore, even scholarship doesn't seem to care. The cases, when you look at them, are just mind-boggling. So go back to the beginning of the Cold War, around 1950. The United States had astonishing security. It had half the world's wealth. It totally controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. And it had military force that was incomparable. There'd never been such security and power in the world's history. But there was one potential threat, and it was understood that it might happen. The potential threat was ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, with hydrogen bomb warheads. Well, they didn't exist, but they were in the process of development, and they would exist. And that would be a threat, not only a threat, but a threat of total destruction to the United States. Well, there is a standard scholarly history of the nuclear arms race, written by McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, former Harvard dean. And he was given access to the highest level documents, internal documents. And in the course of his long history, he has a paragraph in which he discusses this. He points out that he mentions that he was not able to find any discussion whatsoever, even a kind of a staff paper that wasn't submitted, which raised the question whether it might be worthwhile to do something to try to prevent the one lethal threat to the United States, a treaty with the Russians to ban the development of these weapons. Apparently nobody even thought of it, thought of the idea, just who cares? He didn't care either, he just went on to the next sentence. And scholarship apparently doesn't care either, since you can search, almost nobody ever refers to it. And would it have been possible? It's very likely. The Russians were way behind technologically and knew it. They were making peace feelers. There was even an offer from Stalin to allow Germany to be unified, a major threat to Russia, and have a free election, monitored free election, in which the communists would surely lose, with one condition, that it not join NATO, possible military alliance. Very sensible condition if you think about the history of the preceding half century, when Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia several times. It was simply disregarded and dismissed. Now it's recognized by scholarship that it was probably serious, and there were other such efforts, but nobody cared. And it goes on like that. If you take a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, historian Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's close advisor, describes it as the most dangerous moment in history. And take a look at we know tremendous details about it. All the documents have been released and declassified. And if you read through them, it's just shocking. At the peak moment of the crisis, October 27, 1962, there was an offer from the Russians, from Khrushchev, to end the crisis completely by their withdrawing missiles from Cuba and the United States withdrawing missiles from Turkey, Jupiter missiles, which were obsolete and were under a withdrawal order because they were being replaced by much more destructive Polaris submarines. So that was the offer. Kennedy thought about it and rejected it. He even think at that point, his own estimate, subjective estimate, was that there was a 1/3 to a half possibility of a nuclear war, which means a terminal war. It's finished. Major nuclear war leaves essentially nothing. So with that assumption, he was willing to turn down an offer to withdraw obsolete missiles from Turkey, which are being replaced by more lethal ones, in return for ending the crisis. He was willing to do something secretly, but not publicly. It was necessary to humiliate the Russians and show how macho he was. And worse yet, this is praised by scholarship as cool courage under pressure and so on. We're supposed to admire it. 10 years later, Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, called a high-level nuclear alert, 1973. The reason, as he explained, it's not a secret, was to scare the Russians away. This was during the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. Russia and the United States had agreed to impose a ceasefire, but secretly Kissinger had informed Israel that they didn't have to abide by it. The U.S. wouldn't react if they went ahead and destroyed an Egyptian army. And there was a concern that Russia might interfere with what's called delicate diplomacy, so Kissinger called a nuclear alert to warn them to stay away. Fortunately, they did. We survived. 10 years after that comes Reagan's explorations of the Russian defenses, which I already talked about. The point is, this goes on constantly, and it's highly provocative, adventurous actions taken without much concern for whether the population will survive. When governments talk about security, they don't mean security for populations. They mean for state power, for the private power interests that the government supports. That's constant, quite apart from the regular accidents. So you can see why the clock is set at 3 minutes to midnight, and you can see why we right now have to make decisions that will determine the prospects for survival. And there are plenty of other major issues. So you may have seen a report that Oxfam produced every year. Oxfam does a major study on inequality. In 2014, they found that about 90 individuals in the world have half the world's wealth. This year, 2015, turns out that 62 individuals in the world have half the world's wealth. 62 people have what the bottom 3.5 billion have. And that's increasing. It's a disaster, part of the disaster of the neoliberal policies that have been pursued for the past generation. Been a disaster everywhere. Has its own form here, another one in Europe, and its worldwide impact is illustrated by these results. In addition to that, there's a huge refugee crisis, as I already mentioned. The number of people fleeing from their homes is beyond anything in recorded history and increasing. And it's a terrible burden for the rich countries. So in Europe, for example, there's only one country, Germany, that's done something to take in refugees. It's now retreating, and it's considered a huge crisis. Germany's a rich country of over 80 million people, and they're threatened by disaster because they might take in 1 million refugees. Take in contrast Lebanon, a poor country with serious crises internally. About a quarter of the population is Syrian refugees, in addition to other refugees that have fled from the establishment of Israel in 1948 and later actions. But they're somehow managing. Similarly, Jordan. Turkey has over 2 million refugees. In fact, and where are these refugees coming from? I mean, they're coming to a substantial extent as a result of actions that the West has carried out. The U.S. bombing of attack on Iraq, invasion of Iraq, the worst crime of this century, surely. created maybe 2 million refugees who were, as well as destroying the country and inciting an ethnic and sectarian conflict which is tearing the country and the region apart, out of which grew the ISIS monstrosity. Iraq, incidentally, is now ranked as the unhappiest country in the world in world studies of happiness. But millions of hundreds of thousands, probably millions of refugees fled, and they were admitted, not to the United States, to poor countries, to Lebanon, Jordan, Syria before it imploded, Iran. They take the refugees in, we generate them, then we have a crisis. Same with the United States and the areas to the south. You may have seen a dramatic story in the Boston Globe a couple of weeks ago about a man who lived here, who had been here for 25 years, undocumented, had a family, job, children, business, but he had fled from Guatemala. What was he fleeing from? He was fleeing from the areas that had been devastated by a virtually genocidal war in the early 80s in the highlands, which was supported by the Reagan administration. And there are plenty of them around here, incidentally, people, and it's others, the plurality of refugees in the last couple of years was coming from Honduras. Why Honduras? Because in 2000, which was always a very poor country, in 2009, the president of Honduras, President Zelaya, began to institute some very mildly reformist actions. So he was immediately overthrown by a military coup. The United States refused to call it a coup, although it plainly was, because if it had been called a coup, we would have had to stop sending the military aid. And the Obama administration wanted to keep the military aid going. So we didn't do that. Then came an election which practically nobody in the world paid attention to, but the United States legitimized it. And that sank all of this, set off a period of murder and destruction in Honduras, even way beyond what it was for a couple of years. It was the murder capital of the world. People are fleeing. Women, children, others are fleeing. But we have a crisis because they're fleeing here. Europe and the United States are reacting to these crises, so-called, in similar ways. Europe is trying to essentially bribe Turkey into keeping the refugees there. Now it's pressuring Greece to block them. In fact, just the last couple of days, the European Union has called for setting up camps, what amount to concentration camps in Greece, to house the refugees there. Meanwhile, Greece itself is being devastated by savage austerity policies imposed by the so-called troika, the Brussels bureaucrats. But they have to take in the refugees in camps and keep them out at sea. Europe is now planning naval patrols and others to keep the refugees away. We don't want them. And we're doing the same thing. And we're pressuring Mexico to keep the refugees away from our border. So we smash up and destroy Central America, and then when people flee, keep them away from us. And if you really go to the extremes, Donald Trump, build a wall, get Mexico to pay for the wall, and keep them away from us. Now there's an interesting comment on all of this years ago, not about this, but it applies, by Winston Churchill. He wrote back in the early 40s and earlier that the government of the world must be entrusted to satisfied nations who wished nothing more for themselves than what they had. If the world government were in the hands of hungry nations, there would always be danger. But none of us had any reason to seek for anything more. The peace would be kept by peoples who lived in their own way and were not ambitious. Our power placed us above the rest. We were like rich men dwelling at peace within their habitations. We are not a young people, he's talking to the British cabinet. We are not a young people with an innocent record and a scanty inheritance. We have engrossed to ourselves an altogether disproportionate share of the wealth and traffic of the world. We have got all we want in territory, and our claim to be left in unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely maintained by force, often seems less reasonable to others than to us. But we're rich men living in peace within our habitations, and we don't be bothered. You poor countries, you pick up the wreckage and treat us of our atrocities around the world. Now we have to ask the question whether that's who we are. Is Churchill right? Is that who we are? Today, as I said, the New York Times repeats the general celebration that the United States has gone from fears of oil and gas shortages to becoming the world's leading producer of both fuels. Both Russia and the United States are preparing for war and regard it as thinkable. And if that's who we are, our grandchildren and others like them throughout the world are in very deep trouble. Thanks.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much for your words this evening. Right now, I'd like to open it up for, we have around 15 minutes of Q&A. And James is turning on the mic. So we encourage anyone that has some questions to come up to the mic. And again, we have 15 minutes here for Professor Chomsky to take some questions from the audience.
Can I just ask it?
Go for it, yeah.
Okay. So it seems like the closer the U.S. gets to Iran, the more Israel and Saudi are starting to freak out. And I'm just wondering, what do you see in terms of the near future of the U.S.-Saudi relationship?
I don't hear too well.
Is the U.S. gets closer to Iran? How are those
With Saudi?
the U.S. relationship to Iran?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what's happening. Actually, the United States is not getting that close to Iran. If you follow what's happening, European leaders, political leaders, businesses are flocking to Iran to get commercial deals, to make closer arrangements. Airbus just announced they're probably going to sell them a couple hundred airplanes, not from the United States. Nobody comes from the United States because we're blocked by our own sanctions. I'm sure that American corporations are not very happy about it, but we've got to punish the Iranians, and so we're not getting close. Obama's making it pretty clear. So the couple of days ago was what was called Implementation Day. It was the day in which Iran had lived up to all of its obligations under the treaty. They sent out all the low-enriched uranium and so on. And it was celebrated around the world, not here. In fact, on that day, Obama announced new sanctions. Congress, meanwhile, came along with this interesting legislation, which they call visa waiver legislation. It essentially blocks people from entering the United States without a kind of an elaborate procedure if they had visited several countries, one of them being Iran, not Saudi Arabia, which is very significant. Iran is called a state that exports terrorism, very weak evidence, but there's no question about Saudi Arabia. It's the main source of jihadi terrorism. World Trade Center, mostly Saudis. Saudi Arabia has been both funding terrorist jihadi groups all around the world, including ISIS, but even more than that, it's been using its vast profits from oil to spread around the whole Islamic world, the Sunni world, its extremist doctrines. By comparison with Saudi Arabia, Iran's practically a paradise. Saudi Arabia is the most repressive, violent, brutal, extreme fundamentalist country in the world. But it's got oil, so it's our ally, in fact, our oldest and strongest ally. We, Britain, France, can send them tens of billions of dollars of weapons. They basically do what we want, so it doesn't matter what they do internally. In Iran, for example, you can take a taxi driven by a woman. In Saudi Arabia, a woman isn't even allowed to get near a car, unless, certainly not to drive it, unless her older brother or uncle is there to make sure she doesn't walk out of the car. So that's Saudi Arabia. And they don't like the fact that there's even a slight relaxation of relations to Iran. You're quite right. They want to maintain their position of dominance in the Muslim world. And the fact that this is beginning to crumble is very serious for them. Also, they're facing, believe it or not, a financial crisis. Not yet, but it's coming. As we succeed in pouring oil into the world, there's an oil glut, and the prices are going way down. And we're supposed to like it because we can get cheaper gas, which means we can drive more and destroy the world more quickly. So that's very good. But the one effect is that Saudi Arabian profits are declining. They're eating into their reserves, so that's serious too. These are and meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is carrying out massive atrocities using U.S. and British weapons and French weapons in Yemen, bombing indiscriminately, massive destruction, humanitarian crisis. But okay, that's okay. In fact, we keep supporting them because they're our guys. But Iran, we've got to keep them at arm's length. And as I mentioned, if the Republican candidates mean what they're saying, which I assume they do, then the minute they get into office, they tear up the agreement, along with other acts to make sure we destroy ourselves pretty quickly.
All right, why don't we take a question from the right?
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. Thank you for coming out tonight. Really incredible speech. My name's Sam Burzak. I'm a senior here at Tufts University. Just to further your point, according to Dr. Jaap Speer, one of the authors of the Oslo Principles, there's already about 5,000 Bangladeshis migrating from Bangladesh to India a day because of rising sea levels. And I guess my question is a little broad, but in the sense of, you mentioned how, with the exception of Germany, there is not a culture of people that are ready to take on what will be inevitable millions of displaced people across the globe, starting with the island nations and low-lying coastal regions. What can nations do to inculcate more culture of Merkel's, essentially, in the sense that we're willing to take refugees and integrate them into society? We're already seeing the trouble with 4 million coming towards Europe. What's it going to be like when it's tens, potentially hundreds of millions? Thank you.
I did step off, but I believe the gist of the question was handling the refugee crises.
Well, take the United States, the richest, most powerful country in the world, very low population density. Travel around the United States, all forest and empty. How many Syrian refugees is the United States willing to take? I mean, if you listen to Fox News, 250,000. If you look at the facts, maybe 100, 200. It's not that we don't have responsibility for what's happening there. Like as I said, ISIS is an outgrowth of the U.S. invasion. It gets more complicated than that. But we don't want them. And the same is true of the refugees from the south. And many of them are refugees. So I mentioned the atrocities in Central America, but that's not the only thing. Take NAFTA, for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, so-called. It's not a free trade agreement. but by any means, just that the TPP isn't what it's called. But one of the effects of NAFTA, purposefully, was to open up Mexican agriculture to exports from U.S. agribusiness, which is, of course, highly subsidized by the government. And the Mexican farmers are quite efficient, but they can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. So it destroys the campesino economy. Well, what happens to them? They're not going to get jobs in Mexico. They flee here, and then we drive them back, and build walls and kill them at the border and so on. So what ought to be done? In fact, this goes way back. You take a look at American history. Immigrants were welcomed in the United States for a simple reason. We were wiping out the indigenous population and had to replace them. So we wanted white refugees. Not that there weren't problems about it. So, for example, Benjamin Franklin, the man of the Enlightenment, he argued that we shouldn't allow Germans and Swedes because they're too swarthy, but they weren't pure Anglo-Saxons. But anyhow, they were kind of allowed in. And aside from Orientals who were excluded, there was pretty free entry of white refugees until 1924. 1924 was the first major immigration law. It was aimed at Italians and Jews. Those weren't the words that were used. The words were Southern and Eastern Europeans, but it meant Italians and Jews. And that's why millions of Jews ended up in crematoria. They could have come here, but not allowed. In fact, even after the war, after the Second World War, there were still plenty of Jews in concentration camps. No crematoria, but the concentration camps were there. And they were pretty horrible. They were investigated by a U.S. commission. But they couldn't come here because we don't admit refugees. Just take a look at Europe. I mean, if you actually look at what's going on, it is so grotesque you can hardly find words for it. So Trump just made a kind of a fool of himself by saying that Brussels is overflowing with refugees. You can't travel, it's too scary and so on. Belgians didn't like it. But Belgium has a refugee crisis, many coming from Africa. Does Belgium have a relationship to Africa? Yeah. The richest country in Africa with huge resources, which should be the lead of developing Africa, is Congo. The Belgian treatment of Congo was even worse than other Europeans, and that's saying something. And it's not ancient history. It's not just King Leopold. Congo got independence in 1960 from Belgium, theoretically. It had a very promising young leader, Patrice Lumumba, nationalist leader, who was maybe the most promising figure in Africa. The CIA was ordered to murder him, but the Belgians got there first and murdered him. And we don't do things like ISIS, so his body was cut up into pieces and dissolved in sulfuric acid and took care of him. Then the United States and Belgium supported the murderous kleptomaniac Mobutu, who destroyed what was left of the country. Goes up to today. The worst crimes in the world are being committed in eastern Congo. That's substantially by U.S. ally Rwanda, but also by militias, which are closely linked to multinationals that want to make sure they get the minerals that you have in your cell phone and other high-tech equipment. Well, that's Congo. So Belgium is now groaning under a refugee crisis. We have to be really sorry for them. And I think that one should read Churchill's words. Yeah, we can be rich men living in our habitations with wealth acquired by violence and tell everyone else just keep away from us. We're perfectly happy, don't bother. If that's who we are, okay, that's what we should do.
All right, we're running into around 10 more minutes for the Q&A. I know several of you have some great questions. We really appreciate you lining up. I think we're going to be able to take 2 more questions if we could go over here. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Chomsky, you spoke a lot about the political history of the risks of annihilation that we face as a species, but you didn't speak as much about the scientific history, and I wonder if you could say something about, we're currently living through a time period where there's lots of new technological risks we face and new scientific risks that we face from newer developments, and perhaps our ethical obligation as individuals who participate in.
Translator disappeared. Oh, you're here? Okay.
I keep disappearing at all the important times. My
Okay.
apologies.
If you
I'm
could speak
sorry,
a
I
little,
can't hear, but yeah.
if you could speak a little about our ethical responsibility
Ethical responsibility.
as individuals working
Individuals,
in the development of newer sciences
newer science and
and
technology.
the risks that those imply.
Well, that's a question everyone has to ask themselves. It's just a moral truism that we're each responsible for the predictable consequences of our actions. So we have to ask, what are the predictable consequences? That's the ethical responsibility. And it's been interesting the way it's been treated. I've been at MIT my whole professional life for over 60 years, and it's the major scientific technological center. It was developing a lot of the technology that everybody now uses, computers, internet, etc. It was almost 100% Pentagon funded. And there were never any, I happened to be in a lab, the electronics lab, which was 100% military funded. There was almost no discussion in the 50s and the 60s about the questions you're raising. What are the ethical responsibilities? But there was a student uprising in the late 60s, part of the general student movement, led by a couple of young students. Some, you may know some of them, Mike Albert, Steve Shalom, and others went on to good activist careers. Just a couple of students just kind of totally changed the Institute. And one consequence was that for the first time, these questions began to be raised. There was a famous day, March 4th, 1969, when the administration decided to cancel all classes and devote the whole day to these questions. And it had an impact. One group that came out of it was the Union of Concerned Scientists, which deals quite significantly with these issues. And it just changed the culture of the place so that these questions at least were raised, became on the agenda, thanks to student activism. And they should be. But the answer is for each person to figure out for themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll go right here to the left.
Hello, thank you so much for coming to speak. I wanted to address your comments on U.S. responsibility for the current ethno-sectarian conflict in Iraq. I was wondering, it's a two-part question. First, do you believe that there's a possibility for return to the one-state Iraq with an autonomous Kurdish territory that we invaded, or is there going to have to be a secession of some kind? And second part, what is the U.S. responsibility in finding peace in the current conflicted Iraq?
Yeah. Is there still a one-state option for Iraq?
And what is our responsibility?
What's our responsibility? Well, we're responsible for everything that's happening there. I mean, I'm not making it up. This is a principle of international law, fundamental principle. Go back to the Nuremberg trials, which tried and hanged Nazi war criminals and laid a large part of the foundation of modern international law. They define aggression. They say invasion of Iraq was a textbook example of aggression. Aggression is defined as the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes in that it encompasses all of the evil that follows. Okay, that's international law, meaning all of the evil that's happening in Iraq and elsewhere is our responsibility. We don't hang our own leaders, but we could at least acknowledge maybe. So yes, I think it is our responsibility very seriously. What are the chances? It's pretty hard to say. I mean, the country just torn to. There was no. It's important to remember that there was no real Shia-Sunni conflict when we invaded. I mean, in Baghdad, people were living in the same neighborhoods. They were intermarried. You know, the people sometimes didn't even know what sect their friends belonged to. As a result of the invasion, you know, you hit a fragile society with a sledgehammer, and the atrocities and the crimes and the violence and so on. Pretty soon there was a sectarian conflict developed, and once it begins, it just takes off. You know, somebody, you killed my cousin, I'm going to kill your uncle, and you're off and flying. And by now it's tearing the whole region to shreds. And it's also part of the Iran-Saudi conflict that was raised. Can it ever be put back together? It's not at all clear. You know, the Iraqi Kurdistan does want to have independence. The whole Kurdish regions have, for decades, been hoping to find some kind of independent, at least autonomy for Kurdish regions. So they've carved out an area in Syria, northern Iraq, this Iraqi Kurdistan. Turkey's going crazy. They hate it. Most of the Kurds are in Turkey. And Turkey is escalating its attack against its own internal Kurds. And they're also attacking the Kurdish areas in Syria and in Iraq. That's part of the indescribable monstrosity that's going on in Syria. The ground forces that are fighting ISIS, both in Syria and Iraq, are Kurds mostly. They're the ones who rescued the Yazidis, for example. But the ones in Iraq are on the terrorist list, and Turkey bombs them. The ones in Syria, Turkey's attacking, we're kind of moderately supporting. Meanwhile, Turkey's supporting the al-Nusra Front, which is indistinguishable from ISIS. They have a turf battle. Our allies, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are also supporting it. Turkey, there's negotiations supposed to be going on over Syria. Turkey will not permit the Kurds to take part. Not only are they the major ground forces fighting ISIS, apart from the Assad regime monstrosity, but they've also created an autonomous area, which is pretty striking in many of its properties for wartime, fairly egalitarian, rights of women, and so on. This is just an indescribable, I don't know what the word for it is, but it looks as if the borders are all eroding, which is in itself not a bad thing. The borders were imposed by imperial force. The British and the French at the end of the First World War just carved up the region without any concern for the interests of the people, for their own imperial concerns. Same thing happened in Africa. And of course that leads to conflict. Actually, the first thing that ISIS did, their first video, when they started videos, was showing how they were erasing the border between Iraq and Syria, which is a border that nobody wanted at the time. It just cuts communities in half for imperial interests. But all that's beginning to erode, and it's pretty hard to predict what's going to happen.
All right, I think we have, and I know this is unfair for the gentleman over here on the right, but I think we have time for one fast question just before intermission.
Last question. Do we have any hope in the upcoming presidential election, or is that even relevant anymore?
Do we have any hope for the upcoming presidential election?
It's up to you. No, seriously, and it's not a joke. The Republican, I don't even like to call them a party anymore. They're not a party. They're some kind of organization that has just drifted off the whole spectrum of parliamentary politics. And the positions that are taken by the candidates are just shocking. I mean, they're terrifying the world. They can't believe it. But if you look at the policies, it is simply unbelievable. I mean, every one is either a climate change denier outright or a skeptic who says we shouldn't do anything about it and we should increase the use of fossil fuels. So they're saying, let's drive ourselves to disaster as quickly as possible. On the Iran deal, let's tear it up. On Syria, it's easy. We just carpet bomb everybody. And it just goes on like this. It's like, it's surreal. And on domestic issues, it's quite the same. Let's enrich the rich and crush the poor. And unfortunately, they have a lot of mass support. And this election, as soon as they have a very efficient kind of slander, invective, lying machine. And once it gets started, they're holding it back. But whoever the candidate is, once it gets started, it's going to be really ugly. And, you know, everybody knows it takes one sentence to slander somebody, and it takes a page to respond. And people don't listen, and they figure, well, there's got to be some truth on each side. And the appeal to angry, frustrated people can be pretty unpleasant. I mean, I don't want to draw analogies that are too far, but I have to say it does begin to remind me of my childhood. I was a child in the 1930s, and I could listen to Hitler's speeches over the radio. I couldn't understand the words, but the Nuremberg rallies, you could, even as a child, a 7-, 8-year-old kid, you could understand the tone and the reaction, and it was terrifying. And we're beginning to get a little bit of that. Not Nazi Germany, but not nice.
All right. First of all, our apologies for the rest of the folks that lined up. Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I think that was a great question to end on.